It's crazy. I've been here 3 years now, and when I started, there were 12 of us. What are we at, like 100 or something like that now? So it's wild. It's crazy how quickly we've grown. So there's a lot of new faces to me in this crowd. So I will introduce myself, everybody. I'm Chris Affinito. In addition to being an agent here, I am the president of Heartwood Real Estate Group. So if you see a bunch of people in our South office that aren't with Spyglass, that's us. We are a development firm. We develop and build single-family houses, luxury townhome communities, and apartment buildings. And as a big, overly simplified way of describing what development is taking a piece of property and deciding what to do with it, right? And so as part of what I do, I am kind of our resident land use nerd. And so what my goal for this presentation is to get you all more comfortable with answering your clients' questions surrounding land use and construction and whatever that may be. And so I'm going to walk you through some tools that I use that are pretty simple to help you assess like what you're looking at when you're faced with one of these questions and what your options are and how to know where to direct your clients. But I'm a little bit curious also to see what kinds of questions that you are typically getting and what kinds of things that you don't know that you wish you did know. And so who's got clients that are, actual builders that are looking at wanting to find a lot to tear down or redevelop? Okay. Who has clients that, are going to buy a fixer-upper and want to know what they're allowed to do with it? Is that a pretty common thing? Okay.
Especially the ADU edition, like, can we do this? Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
honestly a repeat question at least once a month.
Okay.
Another thing that I get questions about is people that are selling their home that is probably that they wonder if it's going to be better for a builder or not.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to jump into a couple. Does anyone deal with anything outside of the sort of the single family or house and ADU realm? Is anybody dealing with? Okay. Okay, cool. That's a good one. I will cover that too then. So I'm going to kind of get to that later. It's a little bit more complicated than some of the other things. So I'm going to start with just some basic rules around land use and redevelopment for single family lots. Can everybody hear me all right if I don't speak into the microphone?
Yeah, they only record it.
Oh, okay. If I'm messing around on the computer, can I? See if I can just do it with one hand.
Okay.
Okay, so within land use and within the scope of what we're talking about today, there are basically two concepts that I want you guys to understand that are distinct from one another. There is zoning, which tells you what kind of uses you can put on your lot and standards for those uses. And then there are the uses themselves, which is a single family house, right? So where this gets a little bit confusing is that zoning has a bunch of, they're called districts. Each of the different zoning categories is called a zoning district. And in most cities, it looks something like this. You see things that say SF1, SF2, SF3, SF4A, 4B. What does that all mean, right? And then MF, and then a bunch of other stuff. You probably can figure out that SF stands for single family and that MF stands for multifamily, right? But what is the difference between the numbers? And then, what do all the other ones do? And so what this is trying to kind of correspond with what the SF indicates that it is and what MF is, but they kind of sort of bleed into each other. So what we're going to go through in a minute is what the different uses each of these zoning districts permits, because it gets confusing at some point, right? Like SF6, you would think that stands for single family, except that it's telling you that it allows townhomes and condominiums, right? So that means it's not really a single family zoning, is it? It's more of like a multifamily zoning. So that's one of the concepts that I want you to distinguish. Your zoning district isn't house, isn't apartment. Those types of things are the use. And so if you are going to start looking into what you can do with this thing, can you add an ADU to it? How big of an addition can you make? Would you be able to tear this down and build another one up? The thing I would do is I would start by looking up what your zoning district is. There's a couple ways to do that. I think the best tool is called Property Profile. So if you just Google Austin Property Profile, the first link that comes up should be all that you need. And this is sort of all-encompassing. I like it best because it can do some other things that you're probably not really going to be interested in, but it will also, in addition to telling you what your zoning is, look up some important things like, am I in a floodplain? Right, you get that question a lot. So where you want to live is this bar up here, and then to the left, what pressing one of the buttons on that top bar does down here. So who has a listing in Central Austin that we can use as an example? Somebody give me an address. Mm-hmm. The first thing, and you guys will figure this out if you forget it, the program does not want to let you type in your own address. It wants you to start typing it, and it wants to say, do you mean 411 El Paso? You have to click on it. Whoops, sorry, Ryan, what did I do? Okay, and then you can submit. So all that's going to do is find that lot for you and zoom into it. This is just for Austin, yeah. Most cities, I mean, a lot of cities have some kind of, this is called a GIS tool, which, what is that? Graphical, yes, graphical information systems, thank you. Okay, so this is a lot in 78704 off of what, South First or South Congress? And so it's a good example because we know this is a Central Austin neighborhood. This is like an old neighborhood. You know, we're not going to deal with anything that's like a special case, like, I don't know, MUDs or PUDs or something like that. This is like pretty standard. So this is a good example to use. Now that you found this address, the next thing that I do when I'm researching a property is I click Change Visible Map Layers, and this tells me all the things we can do, right? And there's a lot here that's not really relevant to building a house or two. But I always start by looking at what the zoning is. I click on zoning, then I click on zoning text because sometimes you only see the color and not what the actual zoning is. So what this means is that this entire block of yellow here is zoned SF3, and that NP stands for neighborhood plan, which is something we'll get into later, but it's an overlay. And what that does is basically the neighborhood had some input back in the last few decades about maybe some little, typically minor things that might change the normal SF3 zoning. But that you'll find is really common. So once you get off the major corridors with commercial and multifamily zonings, you're basically in the sea of SF3. If I went over here, crossing Congress into South First Street, you're going to see predominantly SF3. Maybe you see this little SF6 thing. But anyway, the point is if you're in Central Austin, most lots are zoned SF3. That's kind of what you can almost assume. But you want to check and see what's going on. And then from there, we can go look at our zoning guide, which I don't know if you guys saw me do that, but literally just Google Austin zoning guide and download the PDF. Now we can look and see what it tells us about SF3 zoning. So like I said, zoning is development standards and the list of approved uses. So start with development standards. Everybody knows what the lot size is. What this means is that is your minimum for a new lot. All right, so if you wanted to subdivide something like we'll get into later, and you wanted to subdivide a lot that is zoned SF3, you could not subdivide lots that are smaller than 5750. Especially around where we're talking about here in 78704 and some of these older central neighborhoods, East Side, Clarksville, places like that, you're going to run into a lot of lots that are smaller than 5750. And that's okay. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to ever build anything. It's called a legally non-conforming use. And there's things that they allow you, and it's actually pretty simple. We'll get into that in a minute. Similarly, if you were to subdivide a new lot, you can design a new lot with a width of less than 50 feet. Again, you're going to run into some lots with 40 feet of width, and that doesn't mean that you can't do anything with it. And then we've got a couple other pretty straightforward things like the maximum height and your setbacks from, your neighbors and from the street. Two important ratios I want to talk about for a minute, just to make sure everybody's clear on them, and the third one I'll add to it. Does everybody know what impervious cover is? Okay, just in case, since I didn't literally see everybody nod, that's basically anything that water doesn't penetrate through, like grass, is impervious. So a roof, a sidewalk, a driveway, that's all impervious. And so you cannot design a site plan on a lot where the impervious cover exceeds 45% if your zoning is SF3.
Pools don't count, right?
The pool doesn't count. The pool coping counts, like the brick or the cement around the pool. Building cover is not the size of your building relative to the lot. That is literally like the area of the roof. So if you have let's say you have a 1,500 square foot building and there's no garage or anything like that, no patios, and your first floor is exactly 1,000 square feet, and your second floor is exactly 500 square feet. Can anyone tell me what the building cover would be on that in terms of square feet? 1,000. Right. The building cover is the area under the roof. The third ratio, which I'm sure you're also fairly familiar with, is floor area ratio, or FAR. That would be 1,500. That is the amount of heated, air-conditioned square feet. And so we will get into this a little bit later as well, but you'll notice that the site development standards here don't even tell you about FAR. Some of them do, right? I can go to a multifamily zoning or a commercial zoning and it'll tell me what the FAR is. And so basically in this SF3 zoning, you basically have unlimited FAR as long as you stay below the maximum height and within the setbacks and within the maximum building cover and impervious cover ratios. What we will again discuss in a minute is that in all the central Austin neighborhoods between Mopac and 35 and down to Ben White and up to 183, there is an extra sort of overlay that is technically called subchapter F, but most people call McMansion, and that's a name you may have heard of before. And that does several things, but the most important of that is that it also limits your FAR to 45%. So that's just something to keep in mind. Unless you guys are outside of central Austin, you're going to look through this thing. Just make a mental note now that your FAR probably also is 45% for single family. So that's your site development standards. Really quickly, I'm going to scroll to a couple other zoning districts and show you how that changes. So SF4A, we can get into, what that is and what the purpose of it is and when you see it and why you see it. But right away, you're going to notice that the minimum lot size is smaller. And because the minimum lot size is smaller, you also have smaller setbacks and you have a bigger building coverage and impervious coverage limit. The idea here is you're talking about doing smaller sort of like, urban lots or something like that, or almost townhome lots. And so as you go through different zonings, you're going to have different site development standards. You get through the single family ones and get into multifamily, and all of a sudden you have a new set of standards. Notice here that they're talking about floor area ratio now, and this particular one doesn't have one, but it does have a maximum units per acre. And that's saying you can build you can build an apartment building here, but you only get 17 units per acre, which is a pretty small apartment building. So anyway, not to get too off track, I'm going to go back to SF3. Now that we've covered site development standards, I'm going to talk about permitted and conditional uses. This gets confusing because there are a lot of conditional uses that nobody ever actually uses. And there are a ton of these uses that they label as civic uses, that like nobody ever uses. So you could look through this and you might notice that like, okay, of this 411 El Paso property in the middle of the neighborhood, technically you're allowed to have daycare services. Like instead of having a house here, you could have a daycare. I'm sure there's all kinds of rules about how big it can be and how many kids are allowed to be there and how many cars are allowed to be there and things like that. But technically you can, right? This is a residential zoning though, so you're going to want to spend most of your time talking about what you can do in the residential realm, which is still confusing. Literally every zoning district in the city of Austin that I've seen has bed and breakfast as a conditional use. And you never see any bed and breakfasts. So I was actually looking up the other day and just saying like, I wonder if I can get into like, the bed and breakfast business and build a bunch of them in single family lots. And basically you can't, like you have to live there. Like you can only have 3 bedrooms. There's a million other rules and there are so many rules about it that it makes sense why nobody ever builds bed and breakfasts. So you take that and you kind of just mentally cross it out. You're probably not going to build a bed and breakfast. You're probably not going to build retirement housing. There's short-term rentals, but I think we're all kind of familiar with the short-term rental rules. If it's your own homestead, you can do it, but generally, other than that, you can't. So that leaves us with really 3 different options. We can do a single-family house, a duplex, or 2-family residential, which is the city's way of describing a house in an ADU. So that's what it's telling us. Overall, in SF3 zoning, generally speaking, in most cases, you're going to build a single-family house, a duplex, a house in an ADU, and you're limited to these development standards. So how does that come into some of the questions that y'all are getting? So I'm going to go back to this El Paso property and see if we can figure out, like the size of it and things like that. So maybe I won't because I don't know. Oh, here we go. I'm going to measure it. Okay, so tell me if this sounds wildly off, whoever the listing agent is, but this is about 0.15 acres, which is something like 6,000 square feet, right? Okay. So let's just assume it's exactly 6,000 square feet, so I don't have to go and do complicated math. But we know a couple things. We know that the total impervious coverage of this lot can't be more than 6,000 times 45%, which is 2,700 square feet. That 45% is also the FAR because this is in central Austin. And so we know that your total heated and air conditioned area cannot exceed 2,700. So do you know how big the house is that's currently on the lot? Yeah. So maybe say it's 1,200 square feet. Right. The cool thing, yes and no. It does include the garage, but there are exemptions from FAR. So it's it's kind of a lot to get into in, however long Ryan wants me to be talking for. But, you can get a detached garage, for example, and exclude 450 square feet of it from your FAR. Your architect will tell you that you can't really get a 2-car garage for 450 square feet. So if you want to build a 2-car garage that fits, the kind of cars we drive around here, you need like 550 square feet. So if that was the case and that's what you wanted to do, you could do it, and it would only count 100 square feet against your total FAR. So it helps. You can also there's a 200 square foot exemption for an attached garage. So if you want to do a single attached garage, you could. It probably actually is going to be 250 square feet. So it'll count 50 square feet against your FAR. And there's a lot of exemptions like that for carports, for covered porches, for roof decks, for all kinds of things. So it's a lot to try to like cover all of that at once and memorize, and it kind of involves going and Googling the municipal code and just reading a bunch of jargon. So to s- Yep, exactly. And the modern farmhouse attic exemption thing, so everybody, the things with a third story, but it's an angled roof. Right, that is an exemption. So if you wanted to totally, let's say we're going to redevelop this lot, we're going to scrape the house and build something new. We can build 2,700 square feet on 2 stories. And let's say we wanted to also add a detached garage that was exactly 450 square feet. We can do that too. We can probably also add a carport off the sides to the side that's 200 square feet. We can do that too. Then if you want to pop a third story on, as long as you've got that, angled ceiling thing that you guys see in some of these new listings, you can do that too. And maybe that gives you another 700, 800 square feet. So now whatever we just listed, we've got 2,700 plus 450 plus 200 plus 800, whatever that adds up to. That's a lot more than 45% FAR, but you're still allowed to do it. So now let's talk about if they did just want to buy the house, keep it generally as it is, not, add on to it, but they did want to add an ADU. Well, assuming there's like literally physically room for it, right? If the house was literally in the middle of the lot like this, maybe there's not room for it, especially if it's a 1-story house that takes up more size on the lot. But, if it's a typical 1,000 square foot old bungalow like they build in this neighborhood, it might be like up here towards the front of your lot. Whoops, I didn't mean to have that. Which means that you're gonna have plenty of room back here to add your ADU, because you still have to keep in mind whatever the zoning guide says your rear setback is. So that might be 10 feet, right? And your side setbacks, this is an interior side setback on both sides because there's no street on either side. So you have a 5-foot setback on either side and a 10-foot setback off the back. So wherever that measures out to, there's probably enough room to put an ADU right there. And ADUs are allowed to be the lesser of 15% of the lot size. So in this case, 6,000 square feet times 15% equals 900 square feet, or 1,100 square feet is the biggest they can ever be. So basically, on this property, you would be allowed to build a 900 square foot ADU in the back. And assuming that this house is about as big as we think it is, say in the 1,000, 1,200 square foot range, adding a 980 square foot ADU, and a garage to it, you're still going to be way under 2,700 square feet.
So they could renovate the house and add on to the house and build.
Yep. And there's a ton of fine print, right? And so like, call myself a land use nerd, and I know enough to be dangerous, but at a certain point you need to sort of like hand it over to an architect to measure and to dig into the code and to look into all of the fine print, because there's always fine print, right? So I think the goal here is to be comfortable enough with this stuff to say, yeah, there's 6,000 square feet here. There's no gigantic protected tree that I can't get rid of. There's no reason that you shouldn't be able to get an ADU here. Let's go talk to an architect and figure out exactly how big and where it has to be. Corey.
How much would those plans cost to get from an architect? If I have someone who's interested in finding out what they can do on a property, and they ask me, okay, how much is that gonna run me to get a quote? What would that look like for this, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there's a wide range. I think anyone tried to hire like a handyman or a remodeler anytime recently, or a plumber, or literally anything. Okay, it's hard to do, especially a small job. The smaller it is, the harder it is to get somebody to do it, right? And so you are looking at like a wide range of architecture fees. And so if you wanted to build a beautiful new 4,000 square foot custom home in Barton Hills, and you're going to go hire the bougiest architect in town, it's going to cost you 6 figures. It might cost you $100,000, might cost you $150,000. For something so much smaller, I mean, that architect would charge you a lot of money still for a 900 square foot ADU, but it'd be less than $150,000. But the problem is you won't get him to do it, right?
That's for like the full project though, right? That's not just to say, hey, I want to know what.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think the goal here is you need to find, and I don't know who this is, right? I have a hard time recommending subcontractors and consultants to people for smaller projects because I don't know who wants to do them. So if you find an architect that wants to do this kind of stuff, great, make friends with him or her. And I don't think that that's the kind of thing like, I don't think a lot of architects are going to charge you by the hour to do a little research. I mean, I think they kind of chalk that up to business development. That's kind of the expectation I would have.
Can you talk about trees for a second?
Yep. Everybody's familiar with the idea of protected trees, right? Okay, so there are two terms. There are protected trees and there are heritage trees. Protected trees, it means that the diameter of the tree is more than 19 inches. And you measure the diameter of the tree, it's called, I forget what they call it, but it's basically about 4.5 feet up in the air. You measure the tree circumference and divide it by pi from geography, or you measure the diameter of it. And over 19 inches is protected. You can't remove that tree without a permit. You can, but you have to get a permit for it, right? The city arborist does. There are private arborists. Anyone run into a guy named Mark Mann? He's like everywhere. It just seems to know everybody kind of guy. And he is a very good arborist. He doesn't even cut down trees. He hires other people to do that. He just consults. And so he will go and look at the health of a tree and make an assessment of it. And so if it's dead or dying, or if it's in an imminent hazard of falling over, you'll be able to get a permit to remove it. If it's an invasive species, like a hackberry tree is considered an invasive species, you should be able to get a permit to remove it. Then the next level up is called a heritage tree. And that is anything that is over 24 inches in diameter and is of like a important native species, like a live oak, for example. You don't even really want to look at that tree wrong, or you could get a fine. So it's important to sort of understand what you're dealing with, right, when you look at the lot, especially in these small 6,000 square foot central Austin lots. If you've got a 30-inch live oak in the middle of the lot, it's really going to, there are not a lot of things that are absolute obstacles to redevelopment. Like a 30-inch live oak in the middle of the lot is probably an absolute obstacle to redeveloping. Okay, great question. There's something called a critical root zone, right? And the critical root zone is the diameter in inches of the tree turned into a diameter in feet around the tree. So in the full critical root zone, there are some restrictions. For example, they don't want you to cover more than 50% of the root zone of the tree with something that's impervious. They think too much of the root system is going to not get water and it's going to damage the health of the tree. Then as you get closer in, when the roots are more critical, like the half critical root zone, for example, would be half of the diameter of the tree in feet. And in that inner ring, you can't build anything on it. You have to build around it, or in certain cases you can cantilever over it, but you can't build into that critical root zone. And then the quarter critical root zone, you can't touch. You have to stay out of it completely.
So if it's 20 inches, that would be?
Yeah. In 10 feet radius, right? So imagine this lot, which is 50 feet wide, and it has a 30-foot live oak right in the middle. You've got a 30-foot circle here that covers most of your lot. 30 feet plus 5 feet of setback on each side is 40 feet. That means you've got 10 feet left. And it goes for 30 feet in this direction too, and you've got your 10-foot back setback, you've got your 25-foot front setback. So you've got 35 plus another 30 for the tree. That's 65 feet of your 130 feet is covered. I mean, this is literally covering half of your lot. So it's an obvious deal killer, yeah. And like I said, a heritage tree is a valuable tree. It's over 24 inches. It's got to be of a native species, right? So not every big tree is a problem, because a lot of big trees are unhealthy. A lot of big trees are invasive species, like a hackberry or something. And it doesn't mean you're not going to get into an argument with a tree reviewer over it, because they kind of tend to go rogue a little bit, but that should not, at the end of the day, stop you from redeveloping it if you use the right consultants to help, like a private arborist or a good architect. So I think the same thing goes with your architect when manage to make a friend of an architect that wants this kind of business and get him to help you sort of lay out a ADU sized box on this site, right? You can also call up one of these arborists and ask him to assess the tree, right? And he can do a full report for you, what he's going to charge you for, or he can take a quick look for you and be like, no, you're not taking that down, or yes, you can take that down, right? I am thinking about getting into subdivisions in a minute, so I wanted to stay on the topic of, generally speaking, like what you can build and how big you can build and when you can and cannot build. Does anybody have another question sort of in that arena? No. What it will show you is, so has everybody heard of a conditional overlay before? A conditional overlay is a deed restriction, but it's not on the deed, it's on the zoning. So basically the city puts a restriction on it. And so if you have that, you can see it. You can look into what you get is, and I don't really want to like look for a lot that has a condition. Oh, you know what? I'm going to look at 2130 Goodrich, our office, because I know that it has a conditional overlay on it. So if you look at this one, it says CS-MU-CO. Let's look it up real quick. So we can look through this table of all the different zoning districts, and we can see that CS down here means general commercial services. MU means mixed use, so you're also allowed to build residential units there. And CO is a conditional overlay. And so that just means, like I said, it's a deed restriction that the city puts on the property. So I can go and sorry. Yeah, I would say it definitely used to be residential. But sometime, probably decades ago, they made it commercial when South Lamar started to become like a major corridor. So then if I wanted to look at this one and find out about the CO, I can go to this review cases thing here and look at the history of zoning cases, because at some point they zoned this thing. Sorry, I keep doing that. At some point they zoned this with a conditional overlay on it. So if you get this little highlight button, you can look at the additional details. I don't know. I think I'm going to give up on that since I can't use a Mac. But you can click on that review case that popped up when you pulled that, and it'll take you to the city's website where it literally tells you the zoning ordinance, and it'll go through and it'll tell you it's like literally an ordinance that says on this lot, like for example, in this Goodrich lot, it says on this lot, you're not allowed to build anything that causes more than 340 trips per day. Or on a residential lot, you might see a conditional overlay and it says something weird like on this specific lot, you can only build 1,000 square feet. And who knows why they decided that decades ago when they did, but that's what they decided. So it's like a deed restriction, but you can't get it here. To get your deed restrictions, you have to basically call your title company.
Probably a dumb question, but does each town have their own website? So like one of my clients is living in Boston, Georgetown. Would I just Google Georgetown property profile?
Yeah, and I doubt they call it property profile. But if you went to like the development services or whatever they call their sort of like development department over at Georgetown, that part of the website, you might be able to find something like that. It probably has it. Different cities do better and worse at it, right? Like Bastrop has something, but it's confusing to use. You know, if you were in San Leanna, I highly doubt San Leanna has a GIS on their website, right? They might not have a website. And so it kind of depends on the complexity of the city that you're looking at. Anything else before I move on to talking about subdivisions?
No, actually, Randy, what did your, she's got a lot she's trying to sell, and the developer that was buying it said that, what was the term?
Okay, cool. What's the address of that lot?
7409 Shoal Creek.
Okay, so we already had zoning on, so we can talk about that while we're here. Zoning's SF2. Gonna go to that super quickly because it's almost identical to SF3. If you looked at these site development standards, and I won't try to scroll back between pages, but they're identical to SF3. The only thing that looks any different here is the number of uses that I see under residential. For some reason, you're still allowed to do a bed and breakfast anywhere. But you are no longer able to do a duplex or a house in an ADU.
Well, and this is a neighborhood with deed restrictions where you can't do an ADU.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if there's a readily available way to, because that when that happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So you got the deed restrictions and you got basically zoning double covering you, but this is probably what, like a quarter acre lot at least. So, this is not quite as tiny as the other one. And so any little floodplain, any kind of weird thing going on is not necessarily going to rule out redeveloping it. But what you're looking for is the erosion hazard zone, which is, just to explain that, is like if you've got a creek bed and you've got your creek, and at some point that's all in the flood zone, right? And at some point, as you get far enough away from the creek, you're no longer in a flood zone. You're no longer in, whatever the 100-year floodplain is, what they kind of look at. That actually means you're in a floodplain. It's like the 1% annual chance of there being a flood in that area. Whereas like the 500-year is, 0.2% of a chance, 1 in every 500 years. They don't even consider that a flood zone. But outside of that 100-year and even that 500-year, you still have this thing that they call it a buffer. It's an erosion hazard zone review buffer. All it means is that it's possible, because of how close to the creek you are, that soil is not really stable. And so if you put your foundation in that soil and you got a flood, they want to make sure your house doesn't erode into the creek. And so what it requires you to do is to hire a geotechnical engineer who can study the slope of the creek bed and the soil beneath it. And they can basically tell you if it's safe to build your foundation there, or if it might not be safe, how do you get around it? How do you re-engineer the foundation to be safe? So I've built houses in the erosion hazard zone. It does take longer to go through review. It's just an added layer of complexity. Again, you're gonna have to hire a geotechnical engineer. And chances are you're gonna have to do something where you're building like a concrete pier under your foundation that goes below the erosion hazard zone into like bedrock, so that you're basically stuck to bedrock. And even if the sort of soil around you erodes, your house isn't going anywhere. And so if you wanted to see if you're in it and how big of it is and how much of your lot it covers, you'd go into this change visible map layers thing again, and you're gonna scroll until you find the environmental section. So in environmental, you can look at the floodplain. And today it's loading slowly.
So you said you've actually done development?
Mhm.
How much more does it cost?
Um,
You say, just on average.
so I'm building a house where it's a big house. It's like 5,000 square feet. And so I don't even know how big the slab is, but it's big. And that slab should have cost me something like, I don't know, $20, $25 per square foot. And say it's 3,000 square feet. And so I would expect to spend $60,000 to $75,000 on that slab. Instead, I have to build that slab, and it has to be thicker, and there's a bunch of piers that are going well into that bedrock. There's like 50 piers. And so instead the slab costs $135,000.